Basically, I was the gate crasher for the party. So I came in and they played Boom Shake the Room by Will Smith and Jazzy Jeff. So I stood in front, I danced, didn't have any speaking role, and then I left.
Wow.
And then they just sort of carried on. My parents, so they are from Sierra Leone in West Africa. They migrated to the UK in, I think it was 1975. First of all down in Cornwall, and then they moved up to London to be closer to my mum's brother, who lived in Finsbury Park, and that's where I was born. So born in Finsbury Park, and then before I can remember, we moved out to Stevenage. So I was raised up in Stevenage. Dynamic of Stevenage was, I guess, quite interesting at the time. My parents, I think, suffered a little bit from being what they term as green. So coming from Africa, the culture is very different. I can even remember a story my dad told me about, he was driving on the M1, but in those days they didn't really have barriers in between the roads. So he's in the fast lane on the M1 and realised he's missed his exit, so he's going to turn around, stopped in the fast lane, late at night, stopped in the fast lane, then did a U-turn to then come back the other way. So just very much instances like those where how they sort of felt themselves as being green. But yeah, so Stevenage was a very much different dynamic. So I think even now, I think it's like 96% predominantly white, and the rest then being sort of dispersed around the different ethnic minorities. So back in those days, I think it was about 70,000 people or so. So that number was even slightly higher. So we were definitely one of like a few black families who grew up in that neighborhood. So culturally, then when I sort of like was growing up, the way the dynamic worked at home was inside the four walls of our house. We were like a first generation West African family who lived in Stevenage. So we listened culturally to cultural music. My mum and dad spoke their native tongue at home to each other, to us as kids. But one thing that was very interesting, and I think perhaps my parents got from their early experiences, was outside of the home, and especially when we started to get towards school, they more taught us of being, I was thinking about it, the best way to phrase this earlier, but almost to dilute our blackness. I think there was almost like, perhaps especially in Stevenage, there's not many black people around.
Yeah. So
maybe somewhat of acceptance was an interesting part, or played an interesting part in that. So they wanted to really sort of scale that back out inside the home. We're a family, we've got our little community as well, so other families around started moving up towards Stevenage as well, leaving London. There was only like a certain amount of us, but especially when we got to a school setting, my brother and I were very much taught that, okay, you need to, at home, this is how we act, but you're almost like living a double life, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that affected, things from like how I spoke, how I walked, my outlook on things, really did sort of play a part in that. Primary school, went to a Round Diamond School based in Stevenage. But yeah, the demographic itself, I was one of two blacks out of the entire school when I first joined. So it was just myself and then one other black child who was in the year above me. So that definitely sort of played in part and parcel with, as my mum was sort of talking about, being able to fit in and to some extent people please. I knew, or I could feel that I was from a different cultural background from, if I went to a friend's house, the food I would eat there wouldn't be the same food I would eat at home. So that definitely sort of played a part. If friends were coming to my house at school, from school, it's like, oh mum, make sure you're not cooking a particular type of food on that day because you didn't want the house to smell a certain way, and your friends to think about, how you were acting at home. But yeah, so school definitely in the early days was, I was predominantly, the only black in my year. That sort of changed as I sort of slowly progressed through, and by the time I left school, I think I was like I think it's about 8.
Right, so
yeah.
were your friends were all your friends white then?
Yeah, all my friends were white.
Did you feel like you were different?
Yes, I think, there's definitely a couple of instances that I remember. I still remember the first time I felt like I was different. I remember it must have been 5 or 6, and we would always play this game at lunchtime, which is like chase the monsters. One person has to be the monster, and the other people have to sort of run away. And I still remember I thought it was because my sort of academic ability. I was very quick at school, would always be the monster. So I'd always be chasing around until the one time I asked, I can't remember the boy's name, but Ross, how about you be the monster? And Ross replied, no, I don't want to do it. You do it better. And it wasn't what Ross said. It was my other friend who laughed. It was more the way he laughed that I thought, I couldn't really sense what it was.
Yeah.
But there was something about the way he laughed that I was just like, oh, okay. And that's, you feel like you're different. And, as I mentioned before, like how you're trying to sort of culturally fit in to people please. So you try and take that little bit of a role. Okay, no, I can do that. I can play into that role. I can still do this. I can be that person who sort of goes forward. So, you do try and fit in, especially at that young age. Like you try and fit in to make sure that you can fit, even though you know that, or you feel that you're definitely different from your peers.
Yeah. And do you feel like your teachers treated you any different?
So that's an interesting question. So I still remember a couple of occasions where, in fact, there was one in particular, a nativity play that we had at school. And so the one thing that we're doing, so I think when you get to like year 6 or the last year of school, they're the group who then do the nativity play for all the parents. So all the parents come in, sit down and watch this nativity play. And they were trying to jazz things up a bit this year and do like a bit more of a modern day play. So one person was Joseph, one person was Mary. You had the baby Jesus who was there, and they were sitting at the Christmas dinner table. So there was a turkey on the table, and everyone was sort of sitting there with the 3 kings and everything. So everyone had their role, and my role was that so that someone would come or I would knock on the door. Someone would then come and open the door. I would burst into the room, and basically I was the gate crasher for the party. So I came in and they played Boom Shake the Room by Will Smith and Jazzy Jeff. So I stood in front, I danced, didn't have any speaking role, and then I left.
Wow.
And then they just sort of carried on. So does that mean our teachers are treating me differently? I don't quite know, but it's just, I guess, more my perception of how I felt about that situation. Something wasn't quite right about that, I felt at least.
Like the significance of the role that you were given.
Exactly, yeah.
And so your secondary school, what secondary school did you go to?
I went to the Barclay School in Stevenage. The demographic for the school, at least when I first joined, it was a little bit higher. I think maybe if we call it about 4%, where was more or overall ethnics, but then blacks maybe making up about 1%. I remember the first time going into school, I was in my first year at school, and as I talked about, my parents had always said, inside the home this is how you act, outside the home this is how you act. So I'm in this sort of role that I'm playing as I'm going to school, and I remember walking up the stairs, and there was this mixed race boy who was a year above me at school, and he was there talking to one of his peers, a white guy, and he was there, and I'll never forget this. He stood at the top of the stairs and said to him, "Hey man, no, that's cool, bless." And I remember standing there like in awe, like looking, thinking, what? How on earth are you been able to sort of be yourself in this setting? And I remember thinking to myself, like, okay, I really want to go and ask him, like, how can you do that? How can you sort of articulate yourself in that way? And it was a culture that there was a lot of like US culture as well, like US black culture at the time, which had sort of been coming up, and I'd seen a lot of that influence, which I sort of felt like I gravitated to a little bit more. People actually looked like me, I guess, as well. I just remember, but from that day on, I was like, that was in awe of him, and we always then from then on hung out every lunchtime. So it was myself, Phil, another guy from a school across the road who was also black, and then one other a Turkish guy, and it was us 4 who were sort of in like this little clique.
Did you have any white friends once you were in secondary school?
I did, but they weren't as such in the core, so to speak. But right. I think it's interesting because it was almost like I felt more at home.
Yeah.
In a odd way, like it really felt like, okay, this is almost like where I belong, and it kind of makes sense to go, as you're going through those early stages of adolescence, you're finding different social groups that you kind of fit with, and this definitely felt like a key group that I fit in with. I think one of the other key things is from my geeky side, I was obsessed with chess.
Yeah. So
I played a lot of chess club, and so there was no other ethnics in the chess club, so it was me and a bunch of other white guys basically were in that group. Definitely, and I still vibe with them and still got on with them. But yeah, that was definitely where I felt more at home.
Were you made to feel proud of your heritage and of your background?
I would say, yeah, there was definitely an element of being proud, like in the home. You know, you have to remember where you've come from.
Yeah.
Without shadow of a doubt. Like, my parents, they made sure they took me to Sierra Leone at a young age so that I could experience life there and, you know, have an appreciation for one, how far they had come and how far then we can sort of continue this journey. And that was always like a message that they sort of repeated regardless throughout like my entire sort of adolescent life.
As some West African families were moving into Stevenage, did you integrate with other families on the weekend, let's say?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, we'd integrate like on the weekends. We would all socialise and always be together in our sort of like our little community, and it was almost like our little bubble, like almost like from my perspective, a place where I could sort of be myself, if you see what I mean, rather than being externalised. I do remember like a couple of occasions actually. So we used to play a lot of basketball, but where I was sort of like leading almost like this double life where, you know, you'd see some of your white friends come down the road and like the way I spoke was two different things. Like, you know, I try as best as possible to speak my native tongue with some of my peers, like my black peers or my peers from the West African community. And yeah, you'd see like one of your white friends and, you know, my tone would maybe go up a couple of octaves and completely change. It was almost like playing this dance a little bit of going back and forth between the two.